Hey, it's Mark here, and welcome to the next edition of the Employee Survival Guide, where I tell you, as always, what your employer does definitely not want you to know about, and a lot more.
Okay, so today we're taking a deep dive into a legal case that could have a really big impact for employees with disabilities. It's called Angel Tudor v. Whitehall Central School District. And you actually sent us a pretty amazing set of documents to work with for this one.
Yeah, we have the Second Circuit Court of Appeals decision itself and the original complaint. Really detailed stuff.
Right, the school district's response, too, laying out their side of things, plus the district court's initial ruling. I mean, it's like we have all the pieces of the puzzle here.
Definitely a multifaceted view.
So our goal is to figure out, what's the big legal question at the heart of all this? And what does it tell us about the rights of people with disabilities, especially in the workplace? Like, that's the crucial part.
Absolutely. And I think having all these documents is so valuable because it's not just the outcome.
It's the journey. Yeah.
It's how we got there. We have the Second Circuit's decision, which is really interesting because it actually overturned an earlier ruling. This was just from March of this year, so very recent.
So we're talking hot off the presses, legally speaking.
Exactly. And then we have Miss Tudor's perspective, right? Her detailed account of what she went through, the legal arguments she's making. But we also have the school district's response. They're pushing back on a lot of those claims, obviously presenting their own defense. And then that initial district court decision that sets the stage for everything that follows.
Right. It's like the foundation of this whole appeal process. And I think for our listeners, the people who really like to get into the weeds of these complex issues, this deep dive is especially relevant because it tackles a pretty nuanced area of the law, and that is the right to what's called reasonable accommodation in the workplace, even if you're able to do your job without it.
Which is the really fascinating part.
Right, because we're not just talking about whether someone can physically show up and check off the boxes on a job description. The Second Circuit is basically saying the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, is about making sure everyone has a fair shot, considering the real impact of their disability.
That's a key point. It's not just about bare minimum function. It's about creating a truly level playing field.
Exactly. So that shift in thinking, that's the big takeaway here. And it could have some huge implications for workplaces everywhere. So let's jump right in. What was that central legal question the Second Circuit Court of Appeals focused on in their decision?
Well, the core issue they addressed was whether an employee with a disability is qualified for a reasonable accommodation under the ADA, even if they can perform the essential functions of their job without it. And that's a really, really critical distinction.
Right. Because you might think, on the surface, if someone can do the job, why do they need an accommodation? But obviously, there's more to it than that. So what did the district court decide initially, and what was their rationale?
Okay, so the district court actually ruled in favor of the Whitehall Central School District, granting them what's called a summary judgment. Now, summary judgment basically means the court looked at everything and said, listen, there's no real dispute about the basic facts here, so we don't need a full-blown trial.
We can make a decision based on the documents alone.
Exactly. And their reasoning was pretty straightforward. Angel Tudor herself admitted she could perform the essential duties of her teaching job even without the specific break accommodation she was requesting. So the district court said, well, if she can do the job without it, then she hasn't shown a necessary component of her claim. Meaning, in their view, she didn't meet the requirements for proving she was denied a reasonable accommodation under the ADA.
So it seems like a simple, can she do the job or not kind of analysis.
Yeah, at that level, yeah. But of course, the Second Circuit didn't see it that way.
Obviously, that's why we're here. So what were the Second Circuit's reasons for disagreeing with that initial ruling? What didn't sit right with them?
Well, they said it very directly. The district court's interpretation, in their words, cannot be squared with the ADA's plain text. And to back that up, they really honed in on specific language in the ADA's definition of a qualified individual. And that definition includes the phrase, wait for it, with or without reasonable accommodation. Mm-hmm. They even quoted the law itself, the part that says it's considered discrimination if an employer doesn't make those reasonable accommodations.
It's like they're going back to the source code of the law.
Exactly. And I think the most interesting part is they went out of their way to stress that reasonable accommodations and necessary accommodations are not the same thing at all.
Okay, so let's dig into that whole with or without phrase. What's the Second Circuit really saying there? Why is that such a big deal?
Their reading of it is pretty simple. You know, lawyers love to overcomplicate things, but sometimes it really is just about the words themselves.
Sometimes plain English does the trick.
Exactly. And they basically said the plain meaning of the statute is this. An employee can still be qualified for an accommodation, even if they can technically do their job without it.
So it's not just about getting the job done, it's about how they're getting it done.
Right. And that's a huge shift from how the district court approached it. Now it's less about, can you perform the basic tasks, and more about, is this accommodation reasonable given your disability? And that, I think, is what makes this decision so potentially groundbreaking.
It broadens the whole conversation. Okay, so the Second Circuit also used this term, remedial statute, when talking about the ADA. What does that actually mean in the legal world, and how did that concept play into their decision?
Okay, so a remedial statute is a law that's meant to fix a specific problem in society. In this case, it's discrimination against people with disability.
Right, it's about solving a problem, not just laying out rules.
Exactly. And courts are generally supposed to interpret these types of laws broadly, to really address the root of the issue. So the Second Circuit is arguing that if Congress had only wanted employers to provide accommodations that were absolutely essential for someone to do their job, they would have used the word necessary, right? But they didn't. They used reasonable, which suggests a much wider scope.
So it's about removing barriers, creating real opportunities, not just making sure someone can technically clock in and clock out.
Exactly.
Now, there was another interesting point in the decision. The Second Circuit mentioned that the ADA might require accommodations to address an employee's pain or other effects of their disability, even if, again, they're technically able to do their job.
Yeah.
Why is that so important to emphasize?
I think this really gets to the heart of what reasonable accommodation is supposed to be about. Because it goes beyond, can you do the basic tasks of your job? It takes into account the human element. What's the impact of this disability on this person's well-being? Can they actually keep working in the long run without unnecessary suffering? And Second Circuit is saying, even if you can grit your teeth and push through it, the ADA might still require an employer to do something reasonable to alleviate that pain, make things more equitable. It's about a sustainable work environment, too.
It's about working with dignity, not just working through pain.
Precisely.
Okay, so let's shift gears and talk specifically about Angel Tudor's case. What was the accommodation she requested? What was she asking for?
She was asking for something pretty straightforward. Permission to leave campus for one 15-minute break during each of her morning and afternoon prep periods. These were times when she wasn't directly supervising students, and she wanted to use that time to manage her PTSD symptoms.
Now, the court documents do go into some detail about Mrs. Tudor's diagnosis of PTSD. What kind of information did her amended complaint include that really gave us a sense of how this condition was affecting her life and her work?
Well, the complaint provided a lot of details, and it's a pretty upsetting story, to be honest. Miss Tudor explains that her PTSD stems from past sexual harassment and assault, and it's affecting her in a lot of ways.
It sounds like it's really impacting her neurological functioning.
Yeah, she says it interferes with everyday tasks. It causes a stutter, which obviously affects her communication as a teacher. She has severe nightmares, sometimes to the point of being physically sick. She's on multiple medications to manage the symptoms, and she's even required psychiatric hospitalization 3 times because of her PTSD. The complaint also mentions that she actually couldn't work for 4 years because of how severe her condition was. And then in 2008, it seems her symptoms got worse again because of some incidents at work. It really makes you realize how critical these legal protections are.
Absolutely. Hearing all this, it's clear this is not just a minor inconvenience. This is a serious and ongoing struggle. Now, the complaint also touches on Miss Tudor's past experiences with accommodations from the school district. What was that history like? And what changed that led to this whole lawsuit?
Well, here's the thing. Miss Tudor had actually been granted a similar accommodation back in 2008. They let her leave campus for breaks. And she felt like, at the time, that was really key to being able to do her job well. But then in 2016, things changed. There was a new administration, and they put in place a new policy that said no teachers could leave school grounds during their prep periods.
So her existing accommodation was basically revoked.
Yeah, pretty much. And when Miss Tudor tried to use her accommodation, she was actually reprimanded for it, considered insubordinate. She told the new administration about her previous accommodation, but they claimed there wasn't enough documentation on file. And instead of, providing more information right then, she ended up taking sick leave and then leave under the Family and Medical Leave Act. It's really frustrating when a system that was working for you is suddenly taken away.
Absolutely. And it puts someone in a really tough position. So what was happening during the 2019-2020 school year that ultimately led to Ms. Tudor filing this lawsuit? Like, what was the breaking point?
Okay, so that year, her schedule included a morning prep period and then an afternoon study hall. The issue was the school district refused to guarantee her that afternoon break where she could leave campus. They said they didn't have the staff to cover her during the study hall, like a librarian. But even though they denied her request, Miss Tudor actually ended up taking those off-campus breaks anyway on 91 out of 100 in-person school days that year. But here's the catch. She said that doing so actually made her anxiety worse because she felt like she was breaking the rules.
So she's caught between a rock and a hard place.
Totally. She needs to manage her disability, but she's worried about getting in trouble for it. It's a no-win situation.
Yeah, it's a tough spot to be in. Now, we have the other side of this story, too. The school district laid out their arguments in the response to the complaint, and we also see their perspective in the district court's initial decision. So what were some of the main points they were making to defend their actions? What was their side of the story?
Well, right off the bat, they denied a lot of Mrs. Tudor's allegations. They questioned whether her disability was as severe as she claimed and whether the accommodation she wanted was actually necessary.
So challenging her claims right from the start.
Right. They also said they offered a reasonable alternative that afternoon study hall, but Miss Tudor disagreed with that. She didn't think that was an acceptable option. And the school district's big argument, which really resonated with the district court, was Mrs. Tudor's own admission that she could do the main parts of her job.
Right, the can she do the job argument.
Exactly. And they also brought up some procedural legal arguments about the timing of her EEOC filings and whether she followed all the proper steps. So, they really went for it on multiple fronts.
It's like a multi-pronged defense.
Yeah.
And it worked at the district court level, at least initially. But then the Second Circuit came in and really turned things upside down. So let's talk about their decision. They vacated and remanded the case.
Cool.
What do those legal terms actually mean? Like, what happens next in this whole process?
Okay, so vacated means they basically threw out the district court's summary judgment ruling. It's like hitting the reset button.
Poof.
Exactly. And then remanded means they're sending the case back to the district court. But the important part is they're sending it back with instructions. The district court has to reconsider everything based on the legal principles the Second Circuit laid out in their opinion. So same facts, but a new lens to look at it all through.
So it's like they're saying, try again, but this time use the right equation.
And were there any specific things the Second Circuit said the district court needs to focus on during this round too? Like any particular homework assignments?
Oh, yeah, they gave them a list. First, they have to determine officially whether Miss Tudor actually has a qualifying disability under the ADA. The district court had kind of assumed that in their initial ruling, but it's still a factual question that needs to be addressed.
They need to nail down that foundation first.
Yep. And then they have to figure out what would be a reasonable accommodation in Miss Tudor's specific situation. And this is crucial. They have to consider whether the accommodation she asked for would be an undue hardship on the school district. Undue hardship is like a legal threshold.
It's like saying, is this going to be so costly or disruptive that it fundamentally changes how the school operates?
Exactly. And the Second Circuit also said the district court needs to take into account Mrs. Tudor's past history of receiving the accommodation and how the school's policies changed over time. Right, that whole back and forth we talked about earlier. So it's not just about the current situation, it's about the context.
Yeah, the whole picture.
Well, this has been a really in-depth look at a complicated case. So for our listener who's been following along, soaking it all in, what's the biggest takeaway from this whole deep dive? What should they be thinking about as they go about their day?
The key takeaway is this. You don't have to be completely unable to do your job to be eligible for an accommodation under the ADA. It's not about barely scraping by. The focus now is on whether the accommodation is reasonable, given the limitations and pain caused by your disability. And that's really about creating a work environment that's truly fair and supportive, where people with disabilities can not just exist, but thrive.
That's a powerful message. In this case, it really exposes a tension that I think a lot of workplaces are grappling with. On one hand, employers want clear policies, efficiency, things to run smoothly.
Standardization, right.
Right. But then there's this legal and ethical obligation to accommodate individual employees with disabilities. And those two things don't always line up perfectly.
It's a balancing act.
And I think the big question moving forward is, as we understand more and more about disability and how it affects people at work, how do workplaces adapt to become genuinely inclusive? How do we go beyond just checking boxes and create environments where everyone can contribute their best work? This ruling, it definitely gives us a lot to chew on.
Food for thought. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
If you like the Employee Survival Guide, I'd really encourage you to leave a review. We try really hard to produce information to you that's informative, that's timely, that you can actually use and solve problems on your own and at your employment. So if you'd like to leave a review anywhere you listen to our podcast, please do so. And leave 5 stars, because anything less than 5 is really not as good, right? I'll keep it up. I'll keep the standards up. I'll keep the information flowing at you. If you'd like to send me an email and ask me a question, I'll actually review it and post it on there. You can send it to mcarey@capclaw.com. That's capclaw.com.